Howdy, y'all. I'm Joe Hughes, and I'm here to give you a presentation entitled From PowerCLI to API. It's all about taking your automation skills to the next level. But honestly, for most of us, especially if you're already involved in PowerShell and PowerCLI scripting, this is really more about taking your skills to the next step in reality. But, that doesn't sound as impressive for a slide title. So let's go ahead and get into it. Who am I? So I'm Joe Hughes, currently a solutions architect at Veeam. Honestly, what everybody would see is more relevant here for this presentation. I'm a co-leader of both the Austin PowerShell and VMware user groups. Typically, you can find me by the green hat, the big grin, and the loud howdy, y'all. I'm just a serial collector of communities. I'm a guy who likes figuring things out. I enjoy playing with all things tech, and I like sharing back with the communities. That's most of how I've had all my involvement with the VMware user group over the past couple of years, and now have even become one of the regional champs to just assist other VMUG leaders to try and help put on shows like this to help you guys and get everybody involved and get back to the V community. I have little shame, right? Try and share my learnings with others. Mostly what this is just, all the things that I've either done poorly or I've had problems with, or I've had many people ask me questions over and over. And eventually, as I've figured out a better way to explain this, I try and share back with the community. So let's get into the actual presentation itself, right? Starting at the beginning, right? So I try and warn everybody you want to define a goal, right? For all things automation, or for anything that you're just trying to work through a project, think tasks and measurable results, right? You want to know where you're starting, you want to know where you're going, you want to have that goal, but ideally you want to have milestones along the way. This really comes into being critical when you're trying to do things in automation, because you want to break down these steps into small components and things that you can actually measure. Speed and performance, right? This is an advantage of your work, but not the true benefit of this. Take a look at the next line here. Really what we want to focus on is things like standardization, validation, and efficiencies gained. This is really going to be the power to you and your organization, right? As you can standardize the way that things are done, you know that they're done a specific way. You know that as you change these steps over time, you can document and change your expected results from this. You can validate all of these changes that you make throughout your code lifecycle. And then you're going to get eventual, gained efficiencies just as you learn how to do things in a different fashion, maybe in just in a different order, as you do things just in a method that gets you to your results quicker. You're going to get lots of other efficiencies along the way rather than just speed and performance, right? And that's not going to be our entire goal for working with an API, although it might be, again, an advantage that we have of working with an API that we get to these results anyway. You also want to use small and incremental changes, right? Again, you want to have that verification. You want to be able to measure your results and know, are you moving in the right direction? Even if things are going slower, but you're getting to your final result in fewer steps, or you're getting there without having to make additional necessary changes along the way. If you can get to your end result in one step, and that code runs a little bit slower, but you now have a verified method and you can maybe check things a little bit better, that's going to be a good thing in the long run. Don't forget the PowerShell basics, right? As we all learned, get help as your friend and it makes your life easier. Think of the same thing with API, right? You're going to go through the documentation. There are going to be things we don't know how to do, we don't understand, maybe we can't easily find. Go to the documentation. One of the advantages we have here working with VMware and a lot of their documentation is absolutely fantastic. It's easy to search, it's easy to find things, or it's easy to find other examples. A lot of us do our best to share with others, and just as we figure things out or as we encounter some difficulty and finally get past it, we want to try and help everyone else avoid the same difficult path that we had to get to there. PowerShell itself, right? It's built for the pipeline, embrace it and use it. Really what I mean with this is just that you're going to get a specific object, right? And then you're either going to investigate it, you're going to look at the properties to look at what information it has about that object, or you're going to work with methods to change the object, right? You're also going to be able to take a particular object and feed it to another commandlet that can do things with it. But the real power you want to understand of PowerShell, right? And to be able to leverage this properly is you want to be able to create commandlets or bits of code that are each going to do a specific action and then hand them off to another bit of code that will do a different action. Even things like reporting, right? You don't want reporting to be in your same scripts and in your same functions that are going to do the actual work of modifying your objects, right? So just think about doing all of these things as simple defined tasks that you could then put together into the pipeline. Similarly with an API, right? We really get into the next line that I've got here, right? Stacking commandlets and results like Legos. This means you're going to take all of these little pieces, right? All the things that you figured out how to put these together, how to take all these bits of code and wire them together, do what it is you want them to do. You want to take these things and put them together to make your end result. Your end result is going to be made up of lots of different pieces and parts throughout your process that you may not see as the whole of the end result. But as you learn different things, or as you learn better or more efficient ways to do this, if your code and all of your commands are more modular in the way that you're doing it, if you've defined your tasks and you've defined what was your results with that measurable goal that you had for it, you can change out pieces of your code and get to a better end result without having to redo everything, right? We want to just keep all of this stuff very modular and do a good job of documenting and defining our tasks and what it is we're trying to do here. In the end, forget what your teachers told you, right? Cheat and look up the answer whenever possible. Between the documentation, even being able to do things in the GUI and just look them up before and afterwards to see what happened, or looking around for code and examples of what others of us have done and made available to you, the only thing that matters in the end is that you get to the result, right? It doesn't matter how you get there necessarily. If you can find somebody else's code and you can understand it, learn something along the way, but you don't have to build all that yourself and still get to the final result faster, why not, right? This is what we're all here for. Which API, right? Here I'm talking about SOAP versus REST. This is just an explanation that we have an older API, right? Both a protocol and a standard built around SOAP. These are Simple Object Access Protocol is what it stands for. These are the old APIs that are actually leveraged by PowerCLI and PyVMommy, right? This is all XML based, so it's going to be more rigid. It's not as simple as it is described in the name, but this is going to be an instance where there are many more examples for your usage that you can pick up and kind of learn from. One of the things that I like using SOAP for to explain vSphere objects and APIs to everybody is just getting them in the mindset of understanding the results that you get back from PowerShell and the .NET objects that you see within a lot of the PowerCLI commandlets versus the raw vSphere object that you get when you're working with things like getView or the extension data of something that gets returned from one of the PowerCLI commandlets. That's leveraging the SOAP API and working with that on the back end. The REST API itself, right? That's going to be the architecture that's used for all of the newer APIs. And again, this is an architecture, right? That's not a protocol. It's not a standard. It's not a very rigidly defined thing the way that SOAP was and that has been around forever. REST is really just more of a methodology of how things should work. This is all talking about using contextual, text-based representations of objects that can be accessible over web protocols. It's intended to be a lot easier. It's going to resolve a lot of the issues that we have with using the SOAP API. But again, it's not a very hard defined standard for this, right? It's just how things should work. There are going to be some new features that are only in REST. Since REST API is the new architecture for the APIs going forward, there are going to be lots of components and lots of features that are only ever put into the REST APIs and may only be accessible that way. We're going to cover an example of this where I've got some PowerCLI code, even some PowerShell code really, that does a wrapper for SSH to go make a change on a VCSA, where it's a simple one line of code to make this change with SSH, but it ends up becoming a lot of wrapper code we have to put around it to handle it properly with PowerShell. And similarly, handling it through the API is setting enable or disable. That's it. This is the kind of stuff we want to be able to look at, right? It's just what are the differences you have of accessing the API natively rather than doing things with PowerShell and having to kind of make it fit into our coding the way that we have it. REST API is also going to translate more to other APIs outside of vSphere, right? Nearly all of the APIs that you're going to find for most modern products are going to be REST APIs. So if you wrap your head around how to work with these, especially with vSphere, if you can do comparisons to see how things were in SOAP, how they are in REST, and just learn how to work with these and learn how to understand and interpret the documentation from something that's a really good platform to learn on, like VMware and vSphere products, it's going to help you a lot more in your journey once you get outside of the realm of vSphere working with APIs. So the tools themselves, what are we going to be working with here? PowerShell, obviously the PowerCLI modules we have in the title. We're going to be working with a lot of this interactively on the console, and we're going to run a couple of simple scripts just to show you guys how we can kind of make some of the more difficult parts be a little bit easier by just having some modular code in there. We're going to leverage vCenter and VCSA APIs. So we're going to start looking at the older SOAP API and just look at performance improvements with our existing PowerCLI code. We're going to do a couple of quick hits with the VCSA API for an introduction. We're also going to look at the vCenter API itself for VM demos, right? And talking about the appliance API versus the vCenter API will make a little bit more sense when we get into the documentation itself. As far as other components, obviously we're going to be working on a vCenter server, as I've mentioned. We're going to leverage the VMware API Explorer, so this is actually going to be on your vCenter server. So without needing an additional tool, without even using things like invoke REST method through PowerShell, you can just interactively through the web browser access this API Explorer and try to leverage the API code by just clicking around, putting in a handful of entries, and click a button that actually says try it now. One of the other tools that we have there is the fact that from the API Explorer, it becomes a little bit easier to understand the VMware documentation. So the two links that we have here are developer.vmware.com and code.vmware.com. Developer.vmware.com will host the API Explorer online, so you can compare the documentation even across like different versions versus what's on your vCenter is going to be only applicable to the version of vCenter that you're running in your environment. Code.vmware.com is going to have all kinds of things like example code. You can look at PowerShell, you can look at Python, you can look at things like Perl. You can get into the Postman collections if you want to get into using an actual REST client and a full REST tool instead of just interactively doing things through the web interface or through PowerShell. Also used in the demos, just for clarity, I'm going to run through some things in VS Code. I'm also going to leverage a commandlet called show-object, and this is actually included in the PowerShell cookbook module on the PowerShell gallery. It's very handy, especially with some of the things we're going to be looking at in the SOAP API and understanding just how some of these objects are constructed and understanding this hierarchical tree that we have to this object and how we can kind of walk through and navigate what properties and methods exist for this thing. This show object commandlet is a fantastic tool for investigating things inside of PowerShell by just having an easier way to view and navigate it. So we'll show that in the demos. And now, on to those demos. And howdy y'all, we are back for the demos. So before we get into the demos and actually looking at code, we're going to start taking a look at our API references here in the VMware documentation. So this is the link that we had earlier, the developer.vmware.com beta for the developer documentation. This is where everything's being moved to for all the API references, but this is where we want to go for the start. Up front, I'm going to apologize to everybody if the video or the audio is not the greatest. Things have been sideways, so I'm now recording this actually sitting in the basement of a rental house with my kids asleep upstairs and doing this on the laptop just kind of on the fly. We're having to work on a nested environment here, so hopefully everything goes well. I got one quick run through of the demos just to make sure I had everything semi-scripted out, and we're pretty much doing this on the fly. So hopefully this goes well for everybody. But you'll get a real idea of how we just kind of navigate around through some of these things and take a look at this. So as we talked about earlier, we're going to go ahead and look at our SOAP API. And really, this is going to be an instance where we might dig into things if we're trying to get more performance out of existing PowerCLI code. I'm going to show you guys some of the things we're going to talk about here. So some of the things to understand about the SOAP API are really going to be the object types and really what it is we're looking at here. So first, we're going to take a look at our managed object types. And the thing to see here in the documentation is that all of this, everything comes from a root service instance object. That's just the core of everything inside of the SOAP API. Then we're going to have these different types of objects, right? We're going to have a managed entity managed object, and then we're going to have a service manager managed object. And really these managed object types, as it says up here, right, it's a core data structure of the server-side object model. This just means these are objects that live on the server. We're getting these back from the API to get information about them and manipulate them and basically exchange that information and those changes back to the API itself. For the managed entity types, these are really going to be components that comprise like all of our inventory of our virtual components. This is going to be things like our data centers, our hosts, our data stores, virtual machines, distributed virtual switches, things like that. And then the other managed object types that we're going to have that we're going to be working with are going to be these service managers, right? These are going to be services that are provided to the entire system, right, back through vCenter. So this is going to be things like our performance manager, license manager, alarm manager, task manager, virtual disk manager, OVF manager, right, and guest operations manager. And some of the things we need to know about with these, right? We have our managed object types that we're working with that are these green squares that are here. We have data object types, which are going to be the actual references themselves, right? This is where we get to the tangible components through a managed object reference, right? These are special purpose data objects, which are the actual instances of the previously mentioned managed objects, right? These are the actual entities themselves that live inside of our environment. So these contain data about these specific objects themselves, right? So if you've ever heard the term MOREF ID, right, Managed Object Reference ID for a VM, that's essentially like the serial number, right? That's the specific instance of an actual VM that lives inside of our environment, where the managed object type is really just kind of a framework. It's the shell of all the properties and methods that should exist for one of these things, but the Managed Object Reference ID for a VM says this is the particular instance that's actually live and running inside of our environment. Now, since we have all of our PowerShell basics down and we reviewed them as we talked about in the intro, right, we should understand what methods and properties are, right? These are going to be the properties that exist, all the descriptions about an object themselves. The methods are going to be the things we can actually do to interact with these objects, or what actions can be taken against them. One of the other things we want to mention here quickly, at least, is enumerated types, right? Enumerations are important just because these are a specific set of predefined values or objects. This means that sometimes you'll need to know what these values are and what's available to you in specific instances for either searching or inputting data. So this is something we will come across when we actually walk through one of these examples here. in the API documentation in a few minutes here. So if you have a question on any of these things, right, just search the documents. If you come to the left side of the docs page, you'll see there's a table of contents where you can search for anything that it is you're actually trying to do here within the API itself. Like if we want to look up any actions that exist for snapshot, type in snapshot, we're going to search, we're going to see back that we have the ability to create a disk from a snapshot, create an actual snapshot. You'll see that there are instances here that exist, say for a virtual machine, we can create a snapshot, or there's this create snapshot underscore task. When you're working with the SOAP API, you have the capabilities of just running one of these actions or running it as a task, which is essentially the same as the dash run async switch. When you're using things inside of PowerCLI, that means it will set a task, run that in the background, and return the console to you as that task continues running without you waiting for that interaction to complete. So just a quick description of some things we've got inside of the SOAP API, and from there we will go ahead and minimize this, and we're going to take a look at some objects themselves, just to kind of see what it is we're really working with here. So let's do a comparison, right? Let's take a look at our objects that we're going to have inside of vCenter, and we're going to take a look at the .NET objects versus the vSphere objects themselves that come back. So I'm just going to run some commands here to go ahead and connect to these instances of a VI server, and we'll do some comparison side by side. Got my lovely PowerCLI warnings for this being not having a scope set. So really all I'm doing here, right, is running some code side by side so we can look at some different ways we would interact with things through PowerCLI. In this instance here, what I'm doing is this $vms equals get-vm. This is running the PowerShell commandlets for interacting with the SOAP API. But if I look at this VM that comes back from get-vm, the important thing that we'll see here is the type that we're getting here. It's this VMware.vim automation.vi core.ipml, right? And you can see it a little bit better here, right? Universal Virtual Machine Implementation. This means that this is a .NET object, right? This has been formatted for us to be something that's a little bit easier to see and understand and work with inside of PowerShell. It's a PowerShell context. It's a .NET context. It's not the true vSphere object that we would see when we're acting directly against the SDKs or the SOAP API itself. So just the formatting that we're going to see, if I run, to let's do VMs 0. Let's look at the first instance of a VM that comes back. We can see that what comes back here is basically a selected set of properties, right? This is the formatted object that shows back for what we would expect to see inside of PowerShell. Whereas in this instance, what I'm running here is this $vms equals get_view with the view type of virtual machine. Running get_view means that I'm actually going and I'm retrieving the vSphere objects themselves. So if I, in this window, go look at $vms 0, what I'm going to see here for get member, oops, this will come back, is I'm going to see that the actual type of the object itself is a true VMware.vim.virtual machine, right? This is a vSphere instance of the virtual machine. You'll see that the methods that come back on this member for, creating and acquiring tickets, creating the screenshots, creating snapshots against this thing, the create snapshot task, were the things that I mentioned were methods that were available and documented inside of the SOAP API documentation itself, right? These are the actions we can take against a raw vSphere object coming from the SOAP API itself. Let me go ahead and expand this out so we can take a look at some of these things here. And if I actually look at this first instance of this VM, you'll see that the object that comes back here looks a little bit different than what we have for that VM0, right? Over here in VM0, when we looked at the .NET object, it gives us back a name, a power state, number of CPUs, and a memory in gigabytes, right? That's just the format data that was given to us of what we want to see when we return that implementation object from .NET. But when we look at this coming back directly from the SOAP API, we're going to see we have things like this capability, this config, this layout EX, this storage object. These are going to be like rich properties that exist that are going to have sub-items within them that we can actually take a look at and dig into. So at this point, if I leverage the show-object tool that I was kind of explaining to everybody, we can take a look and see what additional information we can get about this VM object when we're looking at the raw data coming back from the vSphere object itself as opposed to just the .NET object. So show object is really cool because it actually gives you this hierarchical tree view. So I can see that at the top level, I have this object type of this VMware.vim.virtual machine, right? That's the original type name that I have. I can see all of the methods that I have available to me in this bottom menu, as well as all the properties that exist. But within the properties, the cool thing that we have here is I can actually expand out for this rich capability object. I can now see all of the properties that exist underneath it. There's not a ton of methods for this because it's essentially just getting me back string values for this. But I can see everything that exists underneath any one of these. So if I have information I want to find out and I'm not really sure where it's going to be, say I want to go dig in and I want to find out about the snapshots. I happen to know that this is under the layout, but I could even just look at this and say virtual machine file layout. That might have something to do with storage, right? Or maybe storage has something to do with storage. Oh, storage gives me per data store usage. Very cool. I can find that and I can drill down into here and say, here's the actual instance of the data store that it's on. Here's committed, uncommitted, storage information. I'm going to go look at this layout property and now I can actually see, for this VM that has a snapshot, this property will exist, and I can go get some details about this. And I can find out about the snapshot. I can find out about which files, which data stores they're on to get this information. But the other thing that I was pulling up here to show with all this information is really this elapsed time for this, right? So I've already pulled up these lists of the snapshots that exist for this. In this window, it's from the vSphere objects themselves and looking at the subproperties for this layout snapshot file. And that took me about 2 seconds for all of my VMs to instantiate and find all these. Going through a similar exercise here with the .NET objects took 1.7 seconds. So nothing too bad here. But the other thing that's interesting for a lot of people to understand that they maybe don't know yet is if I actually come in and look at this object that comes back from the .NET object, you have the capabilities of looking at this .extension data property. And you'll notice that some of these names sound familiar, right? We have our capability, we have our config, we have our layout, the layout EX, storage. The properties that come back from a vSphere object are actually embedded in this extension data property from the .NET objects that we get. So you can find a lot of this detail in here and you can tweak some of your existing PowerCLI scripts, especially if you're doing things just like simple reporting, where you can actually pull this information out pretty quickly by just digging through some of the things that are here. And especially if you leverage a tool like that show object, you can find a lot of these things by running one instance of just getting all the data about your environment and not necessarily worrying about having to run multiple commandlets and having to run everything through the PowerShell pipeline, which is just going to cost you performance in the end. So we're going to do another example of this real quick here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run one pre-built script. We're going to go ahead and get this thing kicked off. And then we will go ahead and run another window side by side to do some of this stuff manually, or get some different details, let's say. So in this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get some information about a VM. Let's see, here we go. Okay, got this up. So all I'm doing here is connecting to a vCenter server, and in this instance on the left, I'm going to run a script that I have to pull some environment data. On the right, I'm just doing a comparison of getting VMs, then pulling information about just the snapshots and just the hard disk, and I want to see what the performance hit is of this. So when I look at this, it took me 4 seconds to get back just information about snapshots and disks for these VMs. And it took me, still going here, I'm going to say probably going to be somewhere in the range of 20 seconds, unless it's just a slow connection at the first for this. But what I'm doing inside of this environment data here is this script is gathering lots and lots of information about my vCenter environment. Sorry, y'all, I don't know why my screen is giving me issues right now. What we're doing inside of this script is I'm creating an array list, right, for details about all of our VMs, all of our disks, all of our data stores, and all of our hosts. I commented out everything about the data centers themselves because I've got some things in maintenance mode right now, and it's not going to give me some information back for all of it. But I'm going in and, from the VMs, I'm getting information about what folders they're in, the hosts that they're in, the cluster that they're in. I'm pulling back all of this detail of information from one instance of doing a get view for the VMs themselves, right? So all I do in here is do one instance to collect all the details about the VMs and parse out all this information from all these subproperties that exist inside of here. And then pulling some information about the parents to get back the details about the hosts, the clusters, the data centers that they live in and such. And if anybody looks carefully, essentially all of this information is actually the details that come back from running RV tools, but I've had a couple of instances where that was non-existent inside of environments where customers didn't allow it to run inside of their environment for some reason or another. So I had to essentially recreate a lot of this information to give them just straight code that they could run on the fly. So I'll tell you what, that was a slow run, and I'm guessing that's going to be my initial connection there that paused for some reason. We're going to run this again. So that script itself actually handles the initial connection to vCenter and everything. So all I'm doing is, putting myself back in the proper demo folder so that I've got, a proper output folder for all of these CSV files that get created. It's going to load the script into memory to get the function. It's going to actually call the function and run it against my vCenter server. It's going to gather the details for all of this information of our, again, VMs, disks, hosts and clusters. This is a little bit better now that the connection speed was not slow for the first connection there. So 23 seconds, so a bit slower than running information about just the hard drives and such. But as you can see, I've now got details about, you know, every VM, every disk, every host, every data store inside of my environment that came back from me running essentially 3 instances of get view, right, and parsing out all that detail from there, just because once you kind of know what it is you're looking for, it's pretty easy to pull out some of these pieces of information for this. So now, you know, just to make sure everybody's kind of understanding this, we're going to just show the difference here, really, like just kind of step through it of what these things look like here. Again, this is, you know, just covering kind of the differences of us looking at our .NET objects versus our vSphere managed object views, right? So running our get VM commandlet and then running instead get view for the view type of virtual machine. And if we just run get view type, we can see what different types of objects it is that we can actually get information from if we just pull up all of our enumerations here. So this is going to be like, again, our cluster, compute resources, being, you know, hosts themselves, the data centers, data stores, all of our distributed virtual port groups and switches, the host systems themselves, all of our networks, resource pools, storage pods, virtual apps, virtual machines, distributed switches. You know, all that information is going to be a different type of view that we can restrict the information that we get back to these particular objects that we want to work with. So now I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the documentation for the REST API itself, and we'll start digging into this. Let's get this window closed. So we have our REST API documentation open here. And really this is, you know, just kind of a quick run through for what we can do with the REST API. So we have, the first thing we have to do is authenticate, right? So we'll go through this walkthrough of just creating a session. This is going to be handled when we go through the API Explorer, just because when we're doing it interactively, it's a little bit easier to do. But you're going to create a session, right? Basically, all this means is that we're going to send authentication to it. We're going to get back a header, and we need a token, right? That's what we're going to exchange with the API endpoint to have this. And we're going to use that session ID with this token to send that in all of our subsequent calls that we make. And then what I want to show you here just with a simple walkthrough, this is even the documentation just in the reference, right? But for creating a VM itself, this is kind of an interesting one to walk through because this will show us in the request body, right? What are the properties that are required for us? We have a guest OS, which is an enumeration, so we have to know what this is. And then for placement, we need to know the data store in the folder. Now, kind of like what I mentioned in the intro for this, right? We really want to clearly define what it is we're trying to do in our tasks, because this would be an instance where by us just defining, I'm going to go create a VM, this gives me the label for a guest OS and a placement for a data store in a folder. It's not really enough to have a functional VM to really work with here, right? But this gives us step one. I've created a VM, I've put in the minimum requirements into the API to get to this. Step two, I can actually go fill in the details and make this thing functional. But to know what we're going to work with here, right? We have to feed it a spec. So when I go look at this VM create spec, this specification file is going to tell us all the properties that are available, right? So one of the required things we're going to have in here is this guest OS. So this is going to tell me it's this type of VM guest enumeration. So to get to this enumeration here, now we can actually look and see that the enumeration shows us that it's going to be a particular code, essentially, right, for whatever it is that we're going to be running inside of this environment. So if we were running Windows NT4, it would be win_NT for the name of the OS. That's that specific enumeration. For anything higher than, you know, Windows 10 or even Windows 10 Server, right, it's going to be our Windows_9, Windows_9_64 for 64-bit, or Server 64. Right, so this is the enumerations, and if you dig through the API documentation, where you're going to need these, it's going to link you to these lists for these enumerations. You just need to understand what it is that it's asking you for when you look at the documentation. This being here means it's an enumeration, as opposed to a data store in a folder being just a string name for this. So you would take that spec, feed it back into the create VM API endpoint, and that's how you would connect to things. Okay, so for the next method of interacting with the REST API here, we're actually going to do this interactively with PowerShell. We're going to be running this just using the invoke-rest method commandlets. So I'm going to run a bit of code first, just to allow for a self-signed cert, because that's what I have on this nested vCenter server. I'm going to input a variable for just the name of my vCenter, just because I'm doing this kind of interactively to build it on the fly. I'm building out a base URI, right, universal resource identifier for this thing of basically the name of the FQDN of my vCenter /rest. And then the session URI is going to be, /com/VMware/sys/session. That's what has to be built. That was what was covered in that first walkthrough of initiating the connection and starting a session against the CIS server in the API documentation. So we're just going to go ahead and paste this in, let that get started in the background. Now what we're going to have to do is actually feed it a credential and log in, right? We're going to build our authentication. We're going to format that properly into a header, and we're going to pass that over to invoke REST method as a post method with our header, pull back that value, and that will give us our session ID to be our header to pass to the subsequent calls to the API. So we're going to go ahead and log in with this. vSphere.local. Let's see if I can get this in correctly with the right password. Okay. So now that all of that has run, if I go look at session header, I should get back a token, right? So this is my API session ID where this shows I have properly authenticated. I've gotten back a token, and I can pass this session ID over to other calls to the API itself so we can actually get some information. So a couple of basic things I'm going to take a look at here, right? Just details for the REST API endpoint for the VCSA appliance, right? We're going to go to system, get the version, we're going to get the uptime, and we're going to get appliance management information, right? The health information of this, basically just a green, yellow, red status. And all I'm doing is constructing these URIs and then running an invoke REST method and catching all of these in a variable just to get back the details of what it is we're seeing inside of this API. So for version response, if I go take a look at this, we can actually get back details of what we have for the version of the VCSA appliance itself. If I go look at this value property, you can see the summary, right? What's the actual patch for it? What was the install time? What's the build? What's the release date? What's the version that comes back from this? If we go look at our uptime, this is going to be a simple response that gives us back the strict uptime value for this vCenter server appliance itself. And then for health response, this is going to be hopefully a green status, right? Yeah, just so if we look at this and even go drill down to directly to the value, we're going to get back a string that's going to be essentially a green, yellow, red for our status of our VCSA. And that's a super basic demo for us connecting to the REST API for the VCSA appliance itself to just get back some basic information with some fairly easy to read PowerShell code, right? If you just save the beginning bits to understand how to do the credentials, the logins, and create that session in the first place, all of the interactive code that you're really running here is going to be this bottom half where you're going to construct your URIs that you're connecting to, run invoke REST method, and at this point we're just getting back these details. So we'll move on to the next demo. So what we're taking a look at here, this is my actual API Explorer for my vCenter server inside of my nested lab here. So one of the things I want to take a look at is my API endpoint for the appliance itself. So if I go look at my VAMI for my appliance, you'll see that here I have the bash shell disabled, right? SSH login's enabled, but bash shell is disabled. And I have a function that I actually wrote here. Let's flip over to that real quick. Okay, so now that we have this script up here for this demo, really all the script is doing is I wrote a function. I had somebody that asked me, was there a way that they could use just the posh-SSH module to actually flip a switch and change the appliance shell settings from bash to the appliance shell and back and forth. And I hadn't done this in a while, so I said, okay, sure, we can figure this out. And really all that it is, when you're going to go set bash, this is directly out of the VMware documentation, you just type in shell, you tell it change shell -s space /bin/bash space root, right? Just setting bash shell for the root user and then log out. When you're trying to set it back to the appliance shell, you already have bash up. You already automatically default and drop into that shell when you connect on the session. So all you're doing is changing it back to /bin appliance sh for the root user and then logging out. But all of this code is to wrap, creating a new session, a new SSH stream, and writing all of these lines out to the stream itself, just to be able to run 2 to 3 lines of commands for SSH, all wrapped up in PowerShell to be able to flip this switch inside of the appliance itself, where this is actually an instance of basically something that's just enabled or disabled here inside of the API itself. So one of the other options we have for working with the API itself, right, we can either go through here and we can run through this to change it in the API Explorer. So let's go ahead and do a try it out. Let's go change our value to false real quick. Oops. Let me log in real fast. Didn't realize that had timed out. We'll just vSphere.local for this environment. Aren't live demos fun? Okay, so I'm logged in here as my vSphere.local user. So now if we do show and hide, so what we can actually look at here is we can run this instance of our come on. Okay. All right, I just want to make sure this is actually refreshing, giving me valid data. So this is showing me that the response that I have is that this is true right now. This is showing me that I have SSH enabled on the box. So now what I want to do is I want to take a look at the shell access for this and make sure that we're getting back valid information of if it is enabled or not. So we'll run try it out and we'll see shell access is enabled false. Okay. So what we want to go ahead and do is we can go change this value here and come on, minimize. Okay, sorry y'all. So by running a put action with this request body, we can create this config by clicking on this example value over here and say, I'm going to set my timeout to 0, my enabled to true, and try this out. Okay, try it out. I ran it. It gave me, invalid value for the timeout. That's interesting. Why doesn't it like that? Okay, so it doesn't like a value of 0. So let's go ahead and change this to 10 and see what happens. We're going to try this as 10. Response body comes back as no content, but a response code of 200, which means this is good. So now if I come back up here and look at my shell access again and try it out, we will see that we have an enabled value of false and a timeout of 0. That's weird. We're having a problem here. Well, I've actually got some restrictions that I set in place on this user, but what we're going to do is go ahead and refresh our access again to make sure that we're still showing bash shell disabled through here. The last thing we can do to kind of interact with our vSphere APIs themselves is a commandlet that's called these CIS service commandlets. So I'm going to connect to this real quickly if I can get this up. So we're going to run a connect CIS server. I'm going to get my server. This is going to be my vCenter. Okay, let's vCenter. Give it a credential. Okay, I'm going to log in with my administrator user. Okay, vSphere.local. As long as I did not fat finger that, we should be, nope, it looks like I fat fingered that credential. Non-standard keyboard. Okay, and the last method we're going to take a look at here for interacting with our API is going to be using the CIS service commandlets. So let's go ahead and connect to our CIS server. If I can get some typos out of the way here. Connect to CIS server, and we want to initiate our server. So we're going to use a server parameter. Okay, and let's run with our get credential. Make sure I can key this in correctly. Administrator at vSphere. Okay, let's make sure we get connected. Okay, we've authenticated correctly to our CIS server. These commandlets are really just handy for us being able to actually contact these REST APIs themselves and just work with them natively through PowerShell a little bit easier. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually going to go connect to this and get the CIS service for this access shell method, right? So from the vSphere documentation, if you were to look at the docs for the API, again, what we had here was our appliance access shell, right? That's what we're working with here is appliance access shell. So all I'm doing is calling that, right? So it's com.vmware.appliance.access.shell because we're under the appliance API itself for working with this. So when I look at this shell service, we get a couple of members for this, right? We get some methods and properties for it. So I've got two code methods, a get and a set. So what I really want to do is look at the instance of what this is right now. So I'm just going to get it and see what it comes back with. Well, that's a little bit hard to see, so we're going to do format list. So we'll see enabled, false, right, timeout, 0 right now. So I want to actually know how to work with this thing. So I look and I see up here that there's actually a note property for a help. So what happens if I run .help? Okay, it gives me back some documentation, some operations, and some constants. So I can say I want to get help for the set method that I'm looking at here. So we'll do help.set. And it says, okay, it's going to give me documentation, errors, a definition, and config. So for a definition, I need a config that I'm going to work with. So if I go look at the config, because I want to get into this object itself, and I want to look at the members that are available for me here, I can see I have the capabilities of creating this config that I need to feed back to this shell service itself. So I'm going to go ahead and run a create, and I'm going to go ahead and set this in a variable. I'm going to do shell config. Keep switching back and forth in my head from shell to SSH. So shell config should now be a new config object for this, right? Where I have enabled or timeout. They're currently unset, right? And this is either required as a Boolean or required as a long. So I'm going to do shell config dot enabled true. Okay, and we're going to set our timeout. Oops, forgot my $sign here. Timeout to 600 seconds. So let's see what this does. And I'm going to go ahead and run. So I'm going to run my shell service line again to go get the service, but I'm going to call this shell service current, just so we can actually see what the new settings are for this. So if I run a get against shell service current, we'll actually see, it's still false and 0. What happened? Oh yeah, we forgot to actually set it. So let's go do our shell service. Okay, dot set. I'm going to give it my shell config object. Okay. Give it my shell config object, and I'm going to run my line again for shell service current. Let's call this shell service current. Oops. Okay, and if I run my get method now, we will finally see that if I run this and pipe it to a format list, so we can see this a little bit better on the screen, we have now enabled the bash shell access. It is set to true. The timeout is 576. So if I actually go get this information again, right, we're going to see this is actually going to decrement the counter, right? So as we keep going, we'll see that the seconds are counting down, that it was enabled for 600 seconds and it's now decreasing. So this is the last method of using the CIS service commandlets to interact with the REST APIs, but through PowerShell without having to use invoke REST method. So hopefully this helps everybody out. Thanks, y'all. Hope you guys enjoyed the session, even if this was a little bit of a goof up and a little bit on the fly. We'll put some longer form documentation and videos out. I'll put this on my blog, or we may represent this as kind of a part of a live workshop later on for another vMUG session. So I hope you guys at least learned something from this, and thank you guys for coming out. Please, if you liked or did not like any of this, have any feedback, or have a better way to do this and better way to explain it, please feel free to reach out. I'd be glad to host some folks on this and get you guys to give back to the V community. Okay, thank you all for coming out today.